With over 100 references to the word wine in Shakespeare's plays, we can infer that, yes, the answer to our question this week is that Shakespeare did drink wine. But as ever, that's only the beginning of the story, which is why this week I'm going to share with you a brief little history about wine from Shakespeare's lifetime, including what kinds he would have known about, what kinds he couldn't have known about, and how they were made for the 16th century. Check it out right now on That Shakespeare Life. There's one grape yet. I am sure thy father drunk wine. That's from All's Well That Ends Well, Act 2, Scene 3. In Othello, the line, the wine she drinks is made of grapes, comes from Act 2, Scene 1. And there is another line about grapes and wine from The Rape of Lucrece, which says, for one sweet grape, who will the vine destroy? These references, along with a couple more, connect wine and grapes pretty directly for Shakespeare because, of course, he wrote these lines. But wine was actually made from grapes in the 16th century England. Now, if you've read about wine in the 16th century for England, you'll know that they got a little spicy with it, which means they could take wine and add things like fruit or spices to make their own sort of invention. And it was like an invented kind of beverage. And these different things have different names, like Malmsey, for example, or claret was used this way as well. But grapes were pretty much harvested and turned into wine the way that you see it done today at many heritage vineyards. But let's start with a few facts about grape-based wines from the 16th century. One in particular I wanted to tell you about is called a Trebbiano. Trebbiano is an Italian white wine grape, and it's known for being highly acidic, and it is widely used in the production of wines, including brandies like cognac and armagnac, and even sometimes used in the production of balsamic vinegar. It's one of the most commonly grown grape varieties in Italy, and it accounts for about a third of all the white wines produced there. It did exist in Shakespeare's lifetime. In fact, in 1564, the year Shakespeare was born, a man named Leonardo Fioravanti wrote a treatise, albeit a very short one, about how to distinguish Trebbiano wine from urine. And I'm not making that up. I mean, I'm presuming that his treatise was because they end up being similar in color, but it seems that Fioravanti spent many years learning to distinguish between these two things. Like it was his mission to taste the Trebbiano and taste the urine and figure out which one was what. I will link you to his treatise because I am not making this up and you can read about this. But it boggles the mind why there was even urine in a position to be confused with this wine in the first place. There's obviously a great deal of history to explore there. But in his publication, he goes on to detail like why it's important to make this distinction, exactly how you can learn to make this distinction. And so he makes this huge case for himself. But anyway, you can read about that later. Italians were really big into wine, and you may not be surprised about that at all. But they would often, there were a lot of Italians in Shakespeare's lifetime that would write about the proper way to make wine during the Renaissance. The process is similar to how it's processed today. You grow the grapes, you harvest the grapes, you're going to stomp on the grapes, then you'll strain them, then you'll bottle them, then they will ferment, and it becomes the wine that you enjoy to drink. Now, one of these Italians that wrote about wine and how it was done in Italy published his treatise in 1566. He wrote about how he makes wine and was very sort of arrogant in that way, but justifiably because he was doing this successfully, but he was writing about this is the way I do it and I think this is the way it should be done. Now, he helpfully included an image I want to share with you because it's about the filter that he uses. And when you say filter, you think, oh, it's, going to be this little small thing, but it wasn't. It was huge. Check this out. He has a giant filter. Yeah, so when he got to the filtering part, that's what he used. Now, one man, again, an Italian, named Polidoro Virgilio, I butchered that. Anyway, Polidoro Virgilio, he lived from 1470 to 1555. So he was a little bit before Shakespeare, but I'll tell you why it matters for Shakespeare's history. You see, way back in 1502, this guy came to England and he published his book on winemaking and how it was supposed to be done, and it was a huge bestseller. It went on to get published in at least 110 different editions. It was published in half a dozen languages, and it was published in England. And actually, there was one rather high-ranking Tudor man named Thomas Langley who was in charge of translating this book from Italian into England. Langley was a chaplain to Archbishop Cranmer, which you may recognize from your Tudor history studies, but it's suspected by scholars that studied the translation that Langley actually threw in some Tudor perspectives in there that didn't necessarily apply to Polidoro in his original work, including some kind of poo-pooing of dancing and drinking wine with your midsummer celebrations and things like that, which are much more reflective of Tudor ideals than those that were going on in Italy at the same time period. So they think that Langley sort of slid that in there. Overall, wine was considered this highly luxury item. So unlike beer and ale that was drinking pretty much by everybody, mostly because, someone like Anne Hathaway at her house, for example, would have had a section of her home dedicated to making sure small beer and ale were produced in her home for herself and her family. It was part of housekeeping. You make your bread, you make your ale. This is what they did. And so most people had access to some form of ale. Wine was more of a luxury item, specifically because it had to be imported. So in England, there were wineries growing wine. In fact, in the reign of Henry III, we have records of there being 139 English vineyards hired to produce wine for the crown. But we don't really have a lot of details on exactly what kinds of varieties of grapes they were or what kind of wines they were being used to produce. Today we have Pinot Noir and you have Bordeaux and you have all these different kinds of wine. And it's really hard to track that down for Shakespeare's lifetime, specifically in England. France, Spain, Italy, they get way more specific for this 1564 to 1616 time period. And England really doesn't. And I get the impression from what I'm able to study so far that that's because England mostly relied on international imports to bring their wine into the country, which would make sense for why it was then a more luxury item, because when you're going to the cost of importing it, well, now it's automatically more expensive. And the higher cost cuts out, a section of society that has access to it. So it would have cost you a little bit more money to afford the wine. But if you could afford the wine, some kinds that you would have for Shakespeare's England would have been claret wine. Now, if you've studied your Shakespeare, you'll remember this as the one that Jack Cade talks about in Henry VI, when he says, "When we've accomplished our reign of England, I will order that all the city conduits run with claret." This is the one that he was going to have them instead of their water fountains. I don't know why my brain failed me there. In Henry VI, Part 2, Act 4, Scene 6, Jack Cade says, "I charge and command that of the city's cost, the pissing conduit run nothing but claret wine this first year of our reign." Claret was one of those wines that you could drink straight out of the cask, but it was also a drink people added sweeteners to, like fruits or spices that I mentioned before. Malmsey was another important wine from Shakespeare's lifetime that you see mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. This was imported from an area of Spain known as Madeira. There was a sack wine, Falstaff's favorite drink of choice, and this was a dry white wine that was imported from Spain. It's quite similar to sherry. If you've ever had a sherry, sack is a lot like that, and it was widely enjoyed during Elizabethan times. Falstaff was not the only person to think this was a great drink. Greek and Portuguese wines also gained a lot of exposure in Tudor England, and there were massive imports from those countries into England as well. Interestingly, when I looked into the history of winemaking for England, the Vintners of London existed. Now, this was a guild that had existed way back since I believe the 12th century is when they got started, but they received their first royal charter in 1363, which granted them the right to produce, the wine. And they had this monopoly. They would import wine from Gascony, and then they were this preeminent company in the wine trade in England. I'm unclear with their history if they were in charge of the imports or if they were in charge of England making the wine. That it's a piece of history that I'm just going to say is really interesting, how hard it was for me to answer that question, at least in time for this episode. So hopefully I can chase that down separately. But anyway, by the time the company reaches the mid 1500s, in 1553, Queen Mary actually removes their I guess permission, they're not allowed to be as big of a deal as they were. And so their trading dominance in Europe for wine, especially, just drops off. And actually, today they're more famous for their practice of swan upping because they're in, I don't know how it works in England with the crown, but apparently the king owns all of the swans in the country. Seems kind of weird, but to each their own. And basically, the Worshipful Company of Vintners is given charge over the swans that live on the Thames River. These are the facts that I know. You can let me know what you think about that. But anyway, that's when you go to look up the Worshipful Company of Vintners, they don't actually tell you anything about wine. They tell you about how we have these swans. Okay. So there you go. But so it seems that ultimately the answer here for did Shakespeare drink wine is exactly where we started, that yes, Shakespeare would have drank wine, but the process of making wine, bottling it, and distributing it was happening around and outside of England much more than it was happening in England. It did seem to exist, but it seems to be poorly documented and not fashionable, I guess. International imports were much more popular. Interestingly, before we go, I did want to tell you that because I personally love champagne, I found out that Champagne, the region in France where this wine is produced, was making wine for Shakespeare's lifetime, but not the bubbly beverage that you think of as champagne today. The 16th century was when the famous monk Dom Perignon did figure out how to squeeze white juice from black grapes. And that was a huge innovation in the wine industry. And I'll let you explore the history of how he figured that out and what that meant for the wine region elsewhere. But his method, while it was in place for Shakespeare's lifetime, it wasn't being used to produce the popular bubbly beverage that we think of as champagne. So for Shakespeare, while he might have known about the area Champagne in France as a source for wine more generally, he would never have drank the sparkly champagne beverage that you think of today. But that's a very brief look into the history of wine and what Shakespeare might have drank for his lifetime. If you'd like to learn more about the history of these Italian men I mentioned and their treatises that were being published in England, and definitely Shakespeare would have had access to those. I can't say whether he would have read them or not. But anyway, if you'd like to explore the research that went into today's episode and kind of chase those rabbit holes, you definitely can, because I will put the whole list of research details in the members area of That Shakespeare Life, so you can go and find out more there. And I'll have links to that, as well as some podcast episodes where historians have come on and talked with us not only about wine, but about claret and malmsey, even cocktails. We have an entire episode on popular cocktails and aquavitae. So if you're into alcoholic drinks for Shakespeare's lifetime, check below for some links to the podcasts on where to learn more about that.